Okay, hi everyone. As Donna mentioned, my name is Lauren, and today I would like to share with you one of my most treasured possessions. It's this scrapbook that my dad made for me a few years back. Inside are tons of photos that now remind me of how much love and happiness I felt when he was in my life. But unfortunately, up until a few weeks ago, this book sat for 7 years, accumulating dust under my bed at home. I buried it, just as I had buried my positive memories with my dad, because when he was arrested, I made the tragic mistake of believing that he was a criminal. There are 2.7 million children affected by paternal incarceration. This is 3.6% of our nation's youth, but I am one of 11.4% of Black youth who are disproportionately affected. I used to be ashamed that this has made me who I am, but thanks to Donna's class, The Rhetoric of 21st Century Identity, I have realized how central my father's imprisonment is to my own identity and how imperative it is that I begin to speak up about this epidemic that is currently plaguing our nation. Today, I want to follow two Black children, Black child number 1 and number 2, through their journeys of losing their fathers to incarceration. While they appear to be exactly the same, they come from very different worlds. In some ways, their experiences and stories are similar, but we will see that their long-term outcomes are significantly different. Before we get started, I want to let you know that these children only represent 2 stories along the spectrum of different experiences with paternal incarceration. I will also be referring to both children with he pronouns, as mass incarceration has disproportionately affected Black men and youth. So with that, let's first explore the story of Black child number 1. He lives in a predominantly Black community, and due to historical and structural inequalities, this Black community is also a low-income community, and it is here that the incarceration of Black men is most heavily concentrated, where more than 1/3 of men will go to jail or prison during their lifetimes. Incarceration is a normal life event in this community, and as a result, when this child's father is locked up, it comes as more of an expectation than a surprise. This child is probably very aware of his father's absence. His mother will report that he is not affected or only slightly affected, and he probably won't encounter any stigmatizing remarks from his peer group. However, the fact of the matter is that he will naturally begin to display aggressive behavior in the classroom and develop attention problems as a result of the pain that he is naturally feeling but has to internalize. The normalcy of incarceration in this community leaves him so that he cannot communicate his pain, and he probably won't receive any sympathy from his peer group. Further, due to his exposure to poverty and violence, he is at a heightened risk of going to jail or prison himself, remaining in the cycle of incarceration. These effects are further amplified by his low income status, and he has a 54% chance of remaining at the bottom of the income ladder into adulthood. So while there are stories of children successfully breaking from the cycle in low-income Black communities, research supports that this story is quite typical for many Black children whose fathers have gone to jail, and this has built a shared identity amongst much of the population. I would now like to introduce an alternative story that affects far fewer children, but that is equally as traumatizing. I give to you Black child number 2. He was born to upper middle class, highly educated parents, and due to their experiences in higher education and their socioeconomic status, these parents voluntarily choose to raise this child in a predominantly white community. As a racial minority, the child is socialized to a white friend group and with time becomes highly attitudinally assimilated to this white society, eventually accepting whiteness as the standard. We call this internalized whiteness, and the child will aim to achieve racelessness to disconnect himself from the perceived subordinacy of being Black. Education, which is positively correlated with socioeconomic status, can be used to predict the lifetime risks of imprisonment for fathers in this community. If a Black man has completed some or all of college, he only has a 7.6% chance of being arrested. So with these relatively low rates of Black male incarceration and even lower rates for white men, it is not commonplace for fathers to go to jail here. And as a result, when his father is arrested, this child is not prepared for the suddenness of the event. His family may even partially conceal the true reasons for his father's absence, leaving him further unprepared for the reactions of his community. The disdain and stigma that the community targets towards the father will begin to bleed onto the child and the rest of the family. And this leads him to face more isolation, hostility, and rejection from his former peer group. So remember this attitudinal assimilation that left this child fully adapted to and accepted into the white society. But now that his father has gone to jail, he faces the negative black stereotypes that he worked his entire life to disprove. So he is not only rejected because of his father's incarceration, but he is further ostracized because of the color of his skin. So to recap, if you are black and living in a black community, then it is normalized for your father to go to jail. And if you are black and living in a white community, then your internalized whiteness leaves you unprepared not only for your father's incarceration, but also for the stigma that you will face from your community thereafter. I now ask you to consider how Beverly Tatum, who is an anti-racist psychologist and professor who's actually been visiting Stanford, how she defines racism: a system of advantage based on race. In our country, the system operates to the advantage of whites. Contrary to our two narratives, we can see that if you are white, you have a statistically lower chance of your father going to jail, and if you are white and wealthy, then you will not be stereotyped by your community. So though these two children come from very different worlds, they are similar in that our criminal justice system has disadvantaged them because of their race. And this racism has heavy implications for our criminal justice system and for our country, but many of our reformists are already aware that the system is racist. Thus, I would like to illuminate a second problem that we are facing by discussing the long-term outcomes for these children. And due to the lack of research on black children affected by paternal incarceration in white communities, I would like to reflect on my own experience to do so. So when my dad went to jail, my mother did everything that she could to ensure that my brother and I had access to all of the possible mechanisms to grieve and cope with the loss. She found the best psychologist to whom we could candidly and openly disclose our pain. When my brother was expelled from school, she secured the best homeschool teachers and eventually got him into an incredible boarding school. And similarly, when I slipped into depression, she found a great psychiatrist to put together the perfect combination of prescriptions to alleviate my pain. But on the other end of the spectrum, where arrest rates are high and incarceration is common, children are also acting out in school and growing depressed. The difference, as illustrated in Nell Bernstein's book, All Alone in the World, is that these children are expected to return to life as normal after the loss of their father. They're expected to perform the same way in their classrooms despite not receiving any additional accommodations from their teachers or administrations. They're expected to make it despite having lost their primary source of income and support. But unless these children's mothers or primary caregivers refuse to let these children fall behind, or unless these children are particularly self-motivated, the reality is that they will develop more attention problems in school, more difficulties in their communities, and ultimately remain a part of this unfortunate generational cycle. The stark contrast in the outcomes for these two children is a product of classism, a system of advantage based on socioeconomic status. Because of his access to money, black child number 2 has access to the productive mechanisms to grieve, cope, and reassimilate after the loss of his father, and thus to stay on track to graduate from high school, go to college, and remain in his upper middle class standing. But black child number 1, because he doesn't have any money, is left to his own devices to achieve these successes, which is oftentimes impossible. So given all of this, I have concluded that it is not in fact paternal incarceration that is directly causing the intergenerational cycle of imprisonment in low-income black communities. Rather, it is the socioeconomic inequalities that limit the resilience and mental health of these children, and consequently, many of them are never able to transition out of poverty. Our country often views mass incarceration as only affecting the criminals. But a single arrest is not an isolated event. It has cascading effects that ultimately shape the 21st century identity of many of our black youth. This is nearly 1/10 of our black youth whose stories have been silenced or remained invisible in the eyes of the people responsible for their fates. This is their teachers, their law enforcers, their politicians, the list goes on. This is nearly 1/10 of our black youth who are unable to maximize their potential in the classroom, which is oftentimes the key to breaking out of this cycle. So while many of them may not end up going to jail or prison themselves, they are already locked up in their own personal prisons, barred behind this racism and this classism, and their sentences are often lifelong. Obviously, the most important thing that we can do is to end targeted mass incarceration, but this is no simple problem to solve. Until then, I believe that it is imperative that we move towards a society where the incarceration of black men and fathers is not normalized in the homes or in the schools of low-income black communities. Rather than being treated as a normal life event, paternal incarceration should be treated as cases of PTSD or depression, and we need to give students access to support groups and academic accommodations and school therapists in order to validate them in the whirlpool of emotions that they are naturally facing after the loss of their fathers. In doing so, I believe that we will not only free these children from the cycle of poverty and single-parent homes, but also from the interpersonal battles that many of them are facing every single day. Thank you.